So welcome, everyone. We're here to take the long view in a short-term world, and so that's what we'll do. But first of all, I just want to draw attention to what a characteristically diverse World Economic Forum panel this is. We have Brazil, we have the United Arab Emirates, we have the United States. Which state?
New York.
New York. Mm-hmm. We have Slovakia, the European Union. We have Malaysia. And so what a great lineup. We're in a world where I have a friend who's been coming here for years, hedge fund manager, and he likes to short the conventional wisdom. And the conventional wisdom right now is sort of gloom. We've got geopolitical volatility, the war in Ukraine, decoupling the U.S. and China, risks of food shortages, etc. We've got economic slowdown in Asia, Europe, the United States, simultaneously very unusual danger, potential danger of a global recession. We've got continued COVID issues, continued climate issues, so there's a lot of trouble to look at. But in this trouble, there's also a great opportunity. So I'm going long optimism and short pessimism along the lines of my hedge fund friend, because this is a time when a community like the World Economic Forum can come together and say, we do have a set of problems, but we've had problems before. And it's these sorts of inflection points, and I think this inflection point is as meaningful as the end of World War I, end of World War II, end of the Cold War. And it's the action of people like ourselves at these inflection points that drive them. And so in that context, we are going to, in this world of geopolitical risk, geoeconomic risk, planetary risk, it's very easy to get lost in the short term. And every one of these participants in the panel is faced with short-term issues, short-term challenges, but everyone is going to talk to us today about how they take the more long-term approach to this. I'm going to do a first round of questions with the panelists. I'm going to go to the audience as soon as I can. Let me introduce them first, and then I'll start and really sort of start going down the line. And so the Minister of Finance of Malaysia, Senator Tengku Zafrul Tengku Abdul Aziz, Minister Zafrul, and the Special Representative Lajcak, Miroslav Lajcak. I've known you for many years. I've followed your career. You've contributed richly. I didn't know whether to call you Special Representative President because you're President of the General Assembly, or Minister because you've also been a Minister, but we'll stick with Special Representative here. Lily Shen, President and Chief Executive of Transfix, fascinating company that has 76% growth. She's going to tell us a little bit about that and a little bit about how she thinks short-term and long-term. We then have Kalfan Belhoul, the Chief Executive Officer of the Dubai Future Foundation in the UAE. We've done some work with you with the CEO dialogue that we've done. And so it's great to have you here.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, the very name of your foundation means you've got to be thinking.
I was just going to say that.
Long term. And then Marcos Troijo. Is Troijo the right pronunciation?
It's fine.
I mean, my Portuguese just isn't up to it, so I really appreciate and is president of the New Development Bank, which represents the BRICS, but also you've had a fascinating background in a number of other jobs, and you'll talk about that as well. So really a great group of people. Think about your questions as we're going along. I want to make this as interactive as we possibly can. Mr. Minister, let's start with you and take us to Malaysia. You've been in the job 2.5 years. To come in as a minister right at the beginning of COVID is tricky. And I wonder if you can, as your experience as finance minister, where do you see the greatest need to build strategic foresight in the daily demands for policymaking? Wherever you can, with all of you, use anecdotes, details. You're coming here at 1 p.m. It's the lunch hour, so we want to give you something to chew on. Mr. Minister, let me turn to you first.
Thank you, Frederick. I think the word tricky is an understatement.
Yeah.
Anyway, from the perspective of a policymaker, while we look at the long-term view, the objectives are obviously important, but we need to keep in mind that the emerging economies are affected more significantly in terms of the economic impact as well as the societal impact. Right, the global economy prospects when we first got out of COVID looks very strong, looks very positive. But of course, today, this is no ordinary recovery. We have seen recovery is uneven, is inequitable. We've seen that really depends on the government's capacity, depends on the capability of governments in managing its finance and support economy. So we have seen a divergence in growth. We also see that, as I mentioned, the recovery is uneven because some countries are perhaps more fortunate in others in terms of their resources, right? It's expected as well that some countries will recover from the pre-pandemic much quicker than others. Some are 3 years, 5 years, some even 10 years. As a result, it is critical that the developed economies assist in building capacity, right, and so that they can resume the economic and social progress. Therefore, if you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, many countries and governments were actually forced to focus on short-termism. And at times, this comes with the need to sacrifice future developmental as well as structural reforms. That's what we've seen in some of the developing countries in Asia. While many people, as you know, lost their job and are still at risk of losing their jobs, and businesses closed down during the lockdowns, during the peak of the pandemic, governments actually at that time, during that 2 years, needed to be very responsive. Policymakers need to be very responsive in the short term to keep the economy going, because or else it'll be a free fall. And we've seen that record amounts of fiscal stimulus. Most governments have very aggressive fiscal expansionary policy if they can afford it, and it is really to support the economy. But it is only natural for us to act in that way in the short term, right? Pump prime the economy, because you look at the human brain is hardwired to fear and acknowledge the immediate threats. More recently, I think the big topic here in Davos is one of it is about inflation, the inflationary pressures, not just inflation facing the countries, but also food inflation, the increasing prices in food, this due to disrupted supply chain, etc., etc. I think we know what it is about. And issues such as employment, decent standard of living, and even simple things like having enough to survive the day are frequently, actually, if you look at it, is political in nature, right? So many political issues require governments attempting to balance the interests of the people today, people who are alive today, as well as balance it against those who will live in the future, right? So politicians, who are policymakers as well, mainly, on the other hand, are frequently accused of focusing too much on the short term at the expense of the long term, and in order to appease their electorates as well as to win votes, right? So they are under pressure to act quickly. Many policymakers in many democratic countries are under pressure to act very quickly, and also to deliver tangible benefits in the term of the office to be re-elected. There is less return from addressing slow burn issues, where the benefits actually you accrue later. At the same time, or investing in prevention rather than maintaining current services. So as a result, the question to me, anyway, as a policymaker, of how long-term policymakers and political leaders should look arises, and this brings about uncertainties in terms of policy continuity. So even when a government changes, we've seen that in many governments, policies tend to change as well, right? Therefore, one of the more serious issues that we must look at is, how do we look at the time horizon? We're talking about the long view here. This is especially true when taking action in the short term incur costs. Yeah, many costs, even political costs. But there are also the issue of dealing with uncertainty of the future, right? It is really easier to act within the realms of the known than to plan for the unknown. And the impact of COVID-19 may highlight this. And it's all about leadership at the end of the day. So there will always be trade-off, but as a policymaker myself, we must try and find a solution that benefits the greatest number of people while also considering multi-stakeholder interests. Yeah? And the trade-off must be minimized in my view. So the pandemic actually has presented us with an opportunity as well, for a great reset, and we should not waste this crisis. This includes how we approach the issue on addressing short-term while keeping the long-term view. So hence, once again, for Malaysia anyway, since 2020 when I became the finance minister, we have announced various stimulus packages, but we believe that in the short-term priorities, especially in anticipation of the long-term challenges, we must be based on three principles. One is responsiveness, the other one is responsibility or responsible, and thirdly, on reformist.
So, Mr. Minister, thanks for that fascinating opening statement. Quick question for a quick answer. In this period of COVID, in our own country, President George W. Bush had put in a whole infrastructure in the White House to deal with it, which was taken apart by President Donald Trump, and so it had to be rebuilt. So I would say that Bush was thinking long-term and put something in place. What have you put in place, or what decision do you think you've made in the last 2 years that is a specific decision that is really aimed at the long term rather than the short term?
Yeah. So on the long term, it's all about reform, right? So one of the things we've done is when we do implement or do announce packages, stimulus packages that are actually addressing the short term, at the same time, we must see that it has an effect in the longer term. For example, we extended the reach of social protection. This is really social protection for the vulnerable groups. And in this world, in Malaysia and also in Southeast Asia, the gig economy is very big. It's getting bigger by the day. But they don't have social protection, right? Because they don't contribute to the pension fund. They don't contribute to social security. So when the economy closed down, shuts down, they lost the jobs. And obviously, there's no impact. So there's a very, very big impact to this group of informal workers, right? So what we've done, for example, is we ensure that when we give them the benefits, the cash benefits to them, but we also put some money into the pension funds, into the social security agencies, and ensure that it is matched by the Grabs or the Ubers of this world, so they understand that this is something that they need to do in the longer term. You can't just rely on their income they would receive on a daily basis.
Thank you very much. So, Special Representative Lajcik, former President, General Assembly, former Foreign Minister, current Special Representative. It would be good to use your experience not just to talk about the Balkans, but also it's hard to ignore Putin's war in Ukraine, which is really touching almost everything that we're talking about here: economy, supply chains, geopolitics. How do you think long-term, even as a conflict is unfolding? Obviously, the Balkans, we can look backwards at that, and you're now dealing with what comes after. But how should one also be thinking long-term as we're in the middle of a grinding war in Ukraine?
Yes, we are in the middle of something that was inconceivable 4 months ago, and we could not believe that it might happen. And the Russian aggression against Ukraine has changed everything. It has definitely reshaped the global security architecture and the international relations as we have known it, and we still don't know what will come after. But exactly as you say, we really need to start planning and start shaping for that after, even now, because last more than 10 years, seen from Europe, has been a permanent crisis management. There was a crisis after crisis. It started with the financial crisis of 2009. We had migration crisis 2015. We had transatlantic crisis with the arrival of Donald Trump. We had institutional crisis with Brexit. And now we, of course, had the crisis with COVID. And finally, this monumental crisis with the war against Ukraine. In all these previous crises, there were several features in common. First of all, we were always unprepared. So, which is also a question with all the, think tanks and academic institutions who are planning for the future. We never planned for this. And second, it took us some time to recuperate, but still I had a feeling that we were addressing more the consequences rather than root causes of this crisis. But now we are in a whole new world, and the war in Ukraine is an opportunity for all of us to do things differently and to really make sure that we will not be left unprepared for the future. In case of Europe, what are the key issues we need to focus on? Of course, invest in our security, all kinds of security, hard security, but also energy security, food security, because our vulnerability has been clearly exposed. Stronger resilience and readiness to unexpected events, but also consolidating of our neighborhood. So the Balkans is part of it. You have 6 countries that were given the promise that they will join the European Union 19 years ago, 2003, and they are still in the process. So this is certainly not a speed that is satisfactory, and this war shows that they cannot be left in limbo, like in between 2 realities. We need to consolidate Europe. We have Ukraine, who has expressed the desire to join the European Union. You have countries like Georgia or Moldova, who also wish to join the European Union. So we need to, for years we thought that we have the luxury of playing with time, letting them wait, focusing on our internal issues. No, I mean, we really need to be very clear. We need to know what is our offer, and we must also be able to deliver, but not to the detriment of our own functionality. So therefore, we have to make sure that if we expand the European Union, we must stay efficient, because now we are really expected to be able to act quickly. We will also have to address the issue of decision-making in the European Union, because now in most of the cases it's based on consensus, and clearly it takes more time than we have at our disposal. But I would also say we need to invest into strengthening or restoring transatlantic relationship, because we have taken it for granted, and then arrival of President Trump made it expose the fact that it can be so easily dismantled. And it was so badly damaged after 4 years, and I don't know what would be left out of it if he was re-elected. Now we are having transatlantic honeymoon, but let's make sure that this will be the situation also post-Biden administration. So this is really make this transatlantic bond irreversible. A third element that we need to look into, and this is the former president of the UN General Assembly in me speaking now, we should also try to see the world less Western-centric. It's not all about us, as we sometimes tend to think. I mean, I just visited the UN last week, and you see that half of this world do not see the war in Ukraine the way we see it. So we should probably be less patronizing and invest more in partnerships. And my final point here is that sooner or later the war will end. Russia's credibility has been damaged beyond repair, but Russia as country is here to stay. And it's probably time for us to start thinking, how are we going to deal with the post-February 24th Russia before the reality comes and we will be divided on not knowing what to do and how to do with the country. So this is the moment. Think unthinkable. Think out of the box. This is out of the box situation, and therefore it's really important that we are prepared for what comes after.
Terrific answer. Let me ask you a second question based on your current job. So Pristina and Belgrade. There are all sorts of short-term reasons why they don't get along. There's all sorts of short-term reasons why they can't be European Union members. How do you play on the long term in that kind of situation?
Yes, part of my current mandate is called normalization of relations between Kosovo and Serbia. That means there are two realities. According to one reality, Kosovo is an independent state. According to another reality, Kosovo is not an independent state, it's part of Serbia. So I see as my mandate to merge these two and make it one reality which will be recognized and respected by everyone, which is not an easy task. And of course, the success of this task is directly linked to the credibility of the European perspective. That means this process is linked to the European future. This is why European Union is in the driver's seat of this process. But it really has to be, every progress on the process of normalization should also be reflected in their progress on the European part. So that means that will motivate them more to do the difficult compromises that they are expected to do. I don't want to. I can be lost in detail. I can lose you in detail, which is not what I want. So that's why I will stop here.
Well, we all wish you the best on that, because I think that it's the long-term thinking that brings about peace and short-term thinking that acts against it. So good luck to you for that. Lily, you represent the global business community here. And so I think there's hardly a CEO in the world that won't tell you about the challenges between the short term and the long term. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the company that you represent, Ron, and put this into business perspective, because the short term hasn't gone away, yet the pressure on business leaders right now to deliver sustainability forces them to look into the long term. Talk to us a little bit about how one balances that.
Sure. So let me tell you a little bit just for context about Transfix.
Please.
We are a digital freight company. So what that means is that we have built technology that enables Fortune 500 shippers of all sizes to be able to connect to available capacity anywhere in the U.S. dynamically. Our vision is to really build help build a more connected world where goods move seamlessly, sustainably, and with trust. And I think especially in light of all the crises over the course of recently and over the course of the last couple of years, I think there's two things that we all know. One is that there's no playbook, and we are all trying to figure it out together. And the second is that the only constant is change. And so when you think about the short term and long term, I actually think about them together. And I believe it starts with the purpose and mission of the company that you're building. So therefore, what gets you up every day? What are all your employees coming to work trying to achieve? And being able to deliver every day the needs of your customers. And at the same time, I believe that a lot of what happens and what you're delivering on a short-term perspective and sometimes reacting to and you're learning from can also really inform and also accelerate and even strengthen your business as you continue to move towards your long-term objectives. As it relates to sustainability, I am a firm believer that that needs to be part of your core business. It is not a separate priority. It is not an afterthought. It needs to be integrated into everything that you do. And that's what we do. From a technology perspective, if you think about the core business model, what we've built is actually automation, so bringing digitalization, right, into the process. And as a result of that, the algorithms that we've built is actually eliminating empty miles and eliminating waste and eliminating unnecessary manual processes that exist. So, it's core to the technology and processes and solutions and services that we're delivering to our customers. But, I think of it very broadly. I think about, ESG really integrated into how we operate and run our business. And I think about, from a social perspective, inclusivity is incredibly important to us. And not only in terms of obviously how we're building our solutions, so for and with our customers and carriers and drivers and other partners in the larger ecosystem, but truly as a team. And, I say this all the time to my companies, like it's all about the team. Our employees, our employees are our greatest assets. You can have a phenomenal vision, but if you don't have the right people around you, nothing happens. And from that perspective, I think a lot also comes back to the culture of the company. And how do you turn these moments of crisis and demands in building more sustainable solutions and driving societal change? How do you do this while fostering more connection and also more creativity, both internally and externally, and come out even stronger as a team, as a business, and as an entire sector? And when I think about the culture that we've built as a company, it really we talk about bringing resiliency, right, into the system. And you have to be resilient as an organization yourself. You need to be agile. You need to make sure you're building the right tools and the right systems to enable your team to do that, but to also make sure that you're designing the right experiences for every employee as well. And that's part of our DNA. You know, does your culture really embrace hard, difficult problems and use them as learning opportunities? And on a human level, especially coming out of the last couple of years, you know, how are you able to still connect, you know, as you're going through incredibly high growth? How are you able to still connect with your employees so that they feel at every single day and every single moment that their contributions are making impact? And that's what they've seen. Every day they can see the impact of their efforts, but that they're thriving both professionally as well as personally. I think there's so much that's been going on. I think, you know, being empathetic as a leader is incredibly important during these times.
I love that answer, thinking short-term, long-term, less in terms of quarterly results, but in terms of creating the right culture, hiring the right people, thinking about the employees, a really interesting way of looking at it. You're in the supply chain business.
Yes.
Now think about it briefly on that. When we're in a world of supply chain disruptions, it's an issue for almost every company right now. How do you think of short-term versus long-term in how to address these disruptions?
Yeah, well, it's the supply chain is obviously incredibly complex. No single day is exactly the same. Actually, when you're in supply chain, you are dealing with volatility every single day, every single minute. I think the events that have unfolded over the last months have just escalated. The volatility has just been far more dramatic. So, you know, when I think about short-term versus long-term, there's obviously delivering upon the immediate needs of our customers, right? And when you think about the challenges of the customers and carriers and drivers and everyone in the broader ecosystem, it's been incredibly difficult. But because of where we sit, it's our responsibility to then therefore immediately lean in and figure out how you can help drive, you know, more capacity to shippers when you know, one side outweighs the other, and you know, and the opposite, help drive more freight to the carrier so they can keep their trucks running, so they can make decent incomes. And it's incredibly hard for the lives of these carriers and drivers, and like, you know, you're constantly balancing the supply and demand. So that's from a short-term perspective, continuing to deliver to drive value for our customers. Longer term, there's a lot of change that's needed. And, you know, we're at a moment where everyone is obviously talking about the supply chain, and there's much change that needs to occur over the years. I would say one is moving from being transactional to far more strategic and holistic in thinking about the supply chain. When you think about the way it currently works and operates, obviously every single player thinks about their own supply chain, but no one's really thinking about it at a network level, right? And that's part of the solution and platform that we are building. Working with all the customers that we're thinking about it and optimizing it based on a network level. What's fascinating is also the way in which it works. Actually, I was just in another session, and the CEO of Cisco was talking about this, where it's, you know, it's still very much driven by annual RFPs. And it's also very much driven by market rates. And so there's a lot of volatility even in the pricing, right? And imagine if your cell phone bill was determined by basically others' usage. That's what's happening. So how do you actually rethink, right, what the supply chain needs to look like, or how the matching of freight and capacity needs to occur over time? So from transactional to more holistic and a unified data, I would say unified language and common data sets as well. The other is around collaboration. So, you know, there are obviously many players in this space. It's incredibly fragmented, fairly archaic systems. Everyone also operates in silos. And there's a huge opportunity for all players in this space to really come together. You know, I would say within the private sector, but also between the private and public sector. I think there's a lot that's been occurring more in a very organic, bottoms-up way. But I think that there's an opportunity for, you know, for more people in the broader ecosystem to come together to talk about the change that needs to happen longer term.
Thank you very much for that. I didn't introduce myself in the beginning. Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. I also, before the Atlantic Council, worked for 25 years at the Wall Street Journal. I say this ahead of this question because we have a strategic foresight initiative inside the Atlantic Council, and companies and governments really like working with this initiative because it helps them look at the long term. I've rarely seen a national leadership that has as much strategic foresight as the UAE has had. If you think about what was there 50 years ago versus what's there now. So first of all, condolences on the passing of His Royal Highness Sheikh Khalifa.
Thank you, sir.
But talk to us a little bit about that. You have a Dubai Future Foundation. The name says it all. I was recently there visiting the Future Museum, the Museum of the Future. And so there's this amazing emphasis on the future, but still, you know, your country faces the same short-term challenges as every other country. And so I just wonder, how do you think short-term versus long-term results, and maybe give a little bit of feeling of what role your foundation is playing in this as well?
I mean, first of all, Your Excellencies, dear guests, thank you. I mean, thank you. I'm honored to be here with you all. And I got to, first of all, jump into something you mentioned in the beginning, and it might sound like a broken record to many because I've been saying it for the past 2 days, but I think it's key in the sense that we are in an era where collaboration is more important than any other time in every sense, and we've definitely felt it, and we felt it the hard way in the past 2 years. Some nations did better than others because of that non-collaboration that was not at a continent or a country level, but at a global level. And there's major reiteration on that because of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, because of the advancement of technologies. Today we had an earlier session talking about 6G. They're talking about metaverse. They're talking about data challenges. Where will all that take us? It will take us to the need for more and more collaboration and interconnection. And I think WEF is doing a great job through their Centers of Fourth Industrial Revolutions and many other initiatives that act as nodes of like-minded people discussing global challenges, because we need them more than ever now. Now, I think maybe, I mean, you opened up so many topics, I don't know which one to talk about now. The museum, which I'd love for everyone to come and visit at some point, and I'll definitely connect with each and every one of you. But let me talk about maybe the Dubai Future Foundation and how it all started in the beginning, because you're talking long-term here, and we definitely talk long-term because our mandate is the future. But how it all happened was, it was in a similar gathering to this, which is we call it a sister gathering to the World Economic Forum because we work very closely with them. It's called the World Government Summit. It happens every February, and I hope Your Excellencies and guests, many of you have visited it. And it only took, and that's how our leaders literally function. There was a small immersive experience, probably the size, 3-4 times the size of this room. And it contained an immersive experience of global future relevant dialogues. In every year it would be about something really important. One year it was climate, the next year it was humans and interaction with robotics and digital economy. And it only took one visit from His Highness Sheikh Mohammed to see the level of discussion between the 3,000 average delegates within the summit to realize that this dialogue needs to be institutionalized. And it should not be confined to the delegates of the World Government Summit nor the World Economic Forum. This is a global dialogue. So how can we really create an institution that really shapes a better future for everyone through a foresight planning and a strategy planning and executing projects? And he threw in the seed that he wants to launch an entity that manages. And that's the beauty and what happens there is a seed is thrown, but then we got to figure out how things work in this organization, because it's not something that you can easily benchmark against. Future foundations don't really exist in many places. So it was an idea, it was a thought. Let's institutionalize this thinking and let's come up with a plan. Team was appointed, and we came in to think about how we want to do it. Clearly, foresight, as you mentioned, Frederick, plays a massive role, which means that you need to have a team constantly mapping out what are the global important future relevant topics, because obviously when you talk about the future, it's we had this discussion earlier, it's extremely agnostic. You cannot do everything, so you need to really prioritize, and obviously you look at the usual suspects of important matters. Climate is always there, robotics and mobility are always there, crypto and all those discussions, autonomous mobility, 3D printing, they are there. I need to think about ways on how you can convert those ideas through the mega trends and the opportunities that we develop on an annual basis. And through that, then we work closely with the related stakeholders in the government agencies to ensure execution happens. We're not the executionists. We work closely with them. If it was a telemedicine strategy, we work closely with the health authority. If it was a autonomous mobility strategy, we work closely with the road and transportation. And this brings me to the point where I think long-term planning really depends on a few things. One is, to an early point that has been mentioned, is that this plan needs to stay and needs to stay for long. You cannot keep on reinventing plans. There should be vetting and there should be abiding by plans that do not change with governance change. You need to put a North Star or put a plan and you abide by it. It doesn't mean that it will not alter, and it does not mean that you, most importantly, it does not mean that you won't make mistakes along the way, because you mentioned something in the beginning, Frederick, as well. There's a lot of unknowns when you talk about long-term planning. And when you have unknowns, you have a lot of variables. And when you have a lot of variables, the odds of mistakes happen. But this is a formula of any venture capitalists. I mean, they make a bet on entrepreneurs. 80% of them go bust, but they leverage on the winning bet, right? So I think our leaders kind of manage that same kind of mindset with risk mitigation processes, because you don't want to make mistakes when it comes to cybersecurity or when it comes to autonomous mobility. So you got to make sure you create the right testing environment and the agility of the government to actually make policy change to ensure that it's aligned with the foresight that you are planning. Because if you pump in so much money and you get so many ideas, if you don't have the agility of the government to flip the regulation, the policies in favor of those innovations, there's no point of your foresight and everything that you're doing. And lastly, the mindset is extremely important. The mindset, as in the leaders of different organizations, should be aligned with the same thinking. And you mentioned as well, the team should, and the executionists should also carry the same mindset, which means that this education of future foresight should trickle down from the most senior to the most junior employee to ensure that this takes you to the next level. Obviously, then you have the challenge of short-term planning, because you have so much long-term planning. Like we have a 2071 plan, which is 100 years from the formation of the UAE in 1971. It doesn't mean that we know exactly what will happen in 2071. And we talked about earlier, we used the movie Back to the Future to see what has happened in the movie in comparison today. But having those plans and having the right mindsets is absolutely key.
So, short question, short answer.
Yes.
Legacy. You're a young country. Older countries have legacy systems that are in there a long time. What part of UAE is driven by a legacy, whether it's a modulus, whether it's the family structure, and what new system do you put in place? So what do you have a challenge that other countries that are not quite as young as yours has in terms of not having a legacy system?
As young as we are, Frederick, believe it or not, there is legacy in the sense that the speed of change is so fast that you do have legacy with what you have started with, even as early as 50 years ago. So, and we're used to this dynamic change, because I think, and to people that maybe don't know much about the UAE, 50-year-old nation, which 60 or 70 years even, or 80 years ago, before the formation of the country, our single source of income was pearl trading. And then with the discovery of oil, oil became the main source of income. And now we do not depend on oil because of the diversity in Dubai on the different economies and the tourism, the logistics, and strategically how Dubai became the connection point between the East and the West. And I think, but it's also...
And then not inconsequential sovereign wealth fund either.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the the legacy component made it easier is because even there's more than 200 nationalities living in the country, so the adaptation with different cultures and different communities became much easier for us than anyone else. But you told me short answer, so I'm going to talk about the museum maybe in my next comment, or maybe post the discussion.
I'm sure you'll give a tour. It's amazing. It's an amazing museum, and the design is incredible, and the whole piquant juxtaposition of museum of the future, which is something to chew on. Marcus, there are so many directions we could go in from your perspective of the new development bank and the BRICS. We're seeing a breakdown of globalization. We're seeing decoupling. We're seeing something Henry Kissinger recently called a brand new era. We're in a new era. I'd love to get your view on the whole question of global value chains, supply chains, and the disruption. Is this the new normal? Is this where we're going? And then how do you apply short-term, long-term to this? I was talking to someone just yesterday, a very prominent CEO who has 90% of production of that CEO's main business in China. That was a short-term decision in that person's view for cost reasons that now is causing him incredible difficulty in this current COVID situation. And so what's the more sustainable and long-term approach to that? So I'd love to have your reflections on this.
Thank you very much for the question, Fred, and a pleasure to be here with the panel. You know, as I was coming here, I was thinking about this balance between the short term and the long term, and I keep hearing this sentence whenever we are, and we're talking about this with COVID world. People generally say that we are living through unprecedented times or unprecedented challenges. So I said to myself, and here the film Back to the Future was mentioned, imagine we all boarded a time machine and we went towards the past. Imagine we are on May 25th, 1922, so we're going back 100 years. So you have the rise of totalitarian forces in Europe, and you have militarism in Asia. You have the 1929 stock crash. Those were unprecedented challenges. In the 30s, you have the Great Depression. You have the beginning of World War II. In the 40s, you have half of the decade consumed by the Second World War. In the 50s, you have the onset of the Cold War, the Korean War. In the 60s, you have the Vietnamese War. You have the war in Vietnam. In the 70s, you have the two oil shocks. You have stagflation. In the 80s, you have Latin American debt crisis. In the 90s, you have the war in the Balkans. You have the Asian financial crisis. In the first decade of the 2000s, you have 9/11. You have the war on terror. You have the derivatives crisis in 2008 and the Great Recession. In the past 10 years, you've seen the crisis in sovereign debts in Mediterranean Europe. So we're always going through some very unprecedented challenges. It is almost like the unprecedented challenges are endemic. But there's one thing that's not changing, and I think that is very relevant for us to balance the short term and the long term, which is, if you want to answer the question, why is it that nations rise? Why is it that they become more prosperous? They become more prestigious. They become more powerful. And I think this is true about nations, but this is true about companies as well. Is that the lessons of the past 100 years, and particularly those after World War II, is that nations rise when they successfully devise and implement a strategy to successfully adapt to the changing contours of globalization. The fact is, globalization is like an organism. So for a number of years, the top characteristics remain the same, but then they evolve. For example, from the end of the Cold War all the way to 2008, we were living in deep globalization. More trade, more FDI, there was the Washington Consensus. Those were the chief characteristics of globalization. But then after 2008, they changed, and we've been living through the risk of deglobalization, where we are now. If we're going to look towards the future, and once again, success, I think, is in adapting to these long-term challenges, which require actions right now, I think that the 4 chief characteristics will be, 1, if you take into account even a tough year like 2022, the combined GDP of the so-called G7, so the US, Japan, Germany, and so forth, measured at purchasing power parity terms, will be at around $42 trillion. Whereas the combined GDP measured at purchasing power parity terms of what we could call the E7, the biggest 7 emerging economies of the world, so China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, is going to be $53 trillion. That's 30% bigger than the traditional G7. So the E7, this change in the geoeconomic meridian of the world towards relative more importance to the emerging economies, is going to be here to stay. As something that derives from this first characteristics, not only supply chains, but value networks will shift as well. It's about supply, but it's about the sources of demand. It's about where your marketing centers are going to be, where research and development activities are located. Look at the country of Brazil, for example, where I'm from. Brazil now does more business, does more trade with Singapore than it does with Germany, more with Thailand than it does with France, more with Malaysia than it does with Italy. 20 years ago, Brazil-China trade was $1 billion a year. Today, Brazil-China trade is $1 billion every 62 hours, right? So that is a major, I think, paradigm shift that is going to be with us for the long run. The third characteristic is, and I think this Professor Klaus Schwab put out an article a couple of years ago, is that talent has become so central to how the global economy works that we might say that we're no longer living in capitalism, that we were living in talentism. So there's a new age of talent that is going to affect the relationship between the present and the future, between the short term and the long run. We can talk about what talent means in this particular regard. And then the fourth characteristic of this, say, new age of globalization, or something that we want to have as very defining, is that infrastructure is undergoing a kind of metamorphosis, right? So infrastructure used to mean the physical world, bridges, roads, airports, ports. That continues to be very important, but there's also the onset of technology. So even if we're talking about digital infrastructure, or infrastructure for the 4th industrial revolution, or if you're talking about those traditional eras, there has to be some tech intensiveness. Technology has to be embedded in everything. And this is, for example, one of the things the institution that I'm president right now, the New Development Bank, is very focused on. So if we keep in mind that, of course, we have challenges, and every single decade of the past 100 years has seen unprecedented challenges arise. If we have those 4 characteristics as part of the backdrop of the long view, then we have the right instruments to balance the short-term and the long-term decisions.
So thank you for that. We have about 13 minutes left. I'm going to ask you a very quick follow-up question. Then please come forward with your answers. I did this serially because all of these speakers are in quite different fields. And so I think you've seen a different way of thinking about long-term, short-term. I think you're in a situation where you have a short-term issue in the BRICS, that Russia is part of the BRICS. So what's the challenge, and then what's the long-term solution for you? So in a real situation that you're managing now.
Well, the BRICS are very apolitical in a sense. These are very different nations, so they're different in terms of population size. Some of them are nuclear states, others are not. The difference also in terms of their political systems. But there's one issue in which their interests coincide, which is having resources available for infrastructure investment and for sustainable development. So we focus on where the commonalities are. And at the New Development Bank, yes, we say originated from a BRICS platform, but we have embarked on a process of membership expansion. So now we have Bangladesh, which is the fastest growing country in the world. We have Egypt, one of the top 3 GDPs of Africa. Uruguay, a country with great multilateral diplomacy experience. The UAE, we're so we're in a process of balanced and gradual expansion, and it's been very successful. I mean, our institution 10 years ago only existed as a dream on paper. And now we feature a portfolio of over $30 billion in water, sanitation, energy transition. So it's been very successful.
Thank you so much for that answer. So please, and as you ask your question, identify yourself and to whom you would like to pose the question, please. The microphone will come to you.
Hi, my name's... Is it on?
Yeah.
Yeah, my name's Peter Davis. I'm from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. I've been a lifetime in the university, and it's like taking up monastic vows. You know, you go there and you do your research, and it's very long term. But actually, it doesn't rub off on governments. So having left university now, I've set up a think tank. What nobody's mentioned here is what role do agencies like think tanks, universities, and other entities have in ensuring that the short-term electoral cycle is not the only game in town, but there are actually other future-thinking organizations that are there regardless of who's in power. And I didn't get that impression, other than the Dubai one perhaps. I didn't get that impression from anybody else.
Let me answer very quickly, since I'm the president of the think tank here, and we work very closely with government. I think anyone who's in government, I'd love the answer from also our members in government here. Anyone who's in government knows that you have to make decisions quickly. Yep. And at the White House, there was a president who decided not to start with the daily brief. The daily brief would give the news of what happened overnight. And this president wanted to focus more on the long term. Within 3 days, they had to reverse that because what had happened overnight was just too important. And so then you have to set up a structure in your system, whether the White House or someplace else, that does the long-term thinking. And that's the way that President Bush ended up with his approach to pathogens without even a danger on the horizon. And he did this because he'd read a book about them, and he thought as president that was his responsibility. So I think our job from the outside is to feed that part of the government. So I think for universities and for think tanks, there are two things I find most important. There's the tip of the spear, which is when something is happening and you have to respond to it, how do you provide the most insight into what your decisions today are going to have impact on longer term? Ukraine, for example, right now. Ukraine's going to have generational impact on almost everything we believe in. And then the long term is the fundamental research, which doesn't get read by policymakers, but it does influence the thinking, the basis upon which all decisions are made over time. And so I find fast react and fundamental research to be the most important thing that we can do for governments. But anyone else want to take that on, please?
I'm happy to comment because I appreciate this comment so much, and I think we are far from close to achieving the linkage between academia when it comes to research, and I'm talking about the UAE, but I think in general the investment in R&D and research and applied research and the value you get from your academia to contribute to decision making and future foresight. I don't think we're there yet, but I think the linkage is extremely important, and the investment in that is extremely important if we want to create a better future. So I think our next phase, to your point, which I very much appreciate, is what can we do with our research arm to get even more imagination and foresight across different bodies. So the Center of Fourth Industrial Revolution, again, acts as a node for us. We speak to the world, we understand what are the, because different challenges can be for different ecosystems. So you get to learn and understand from different ecosystems. But the academia can be an excellent feeder to this foresight. And I think our next phase, to your point, at the moment is to really make sure that we have a right governance structure to have kind of a feeding structure from academia to foresight, which I believe is very important.
Please.
Thank you very much. I also like this question because I have my own experience as a foreign policy maker and also a member of the government. And we need each other, the politics, academia, and think tanks. Very often we are following the same subject, but from different perspective. And of course, the academia has the advantage that there is no political pressure, there is no accountability through the next elections. But sometimes the academia also drifts apart from or far away from the reality and deals with academic issues rather than or theoretical issues. What we need is, of course, to help with the views how to solve, with academic views, how to solve the practical policy problems. Think tanks, they tend to be black and white. It's good or bad. You know, when you are in politics, there are many compromises you have to make. There are many angles you have to take into account, which the think tankers don't appreciate, and they want to be really straightforward. So therefore, it's really important to know each other's constraints in a way, but also avoid the situation that we are all locked in our own bubbles. Yeah. Because then you are producing ideas which cannot be implemented in real world, or we are only talking to ourselves and we are unable to receive fresh ideas that you may have plenty of. So therefore, I would really strongly support the greater interaction and closer cooperation between these three societies, which are really very, very important.
Thank you for that. Please, let's take these two questions.
Good afternoon. My name is Samaila Zubeiru from the Africa Finance Corporation. My question is really around when we're thinking of the energy transition and the vast amount of minerals and metals that will be required for electric vehicles, for wind turbines, and all of them. How are we thinking about sourcing these minerals and metals in a sustainable way? And how are we thinking about the logistics around them in a way that it doesn't contribute to even more greenhouse gas emissions because of the current way in which we are mining, shipping, processing, and then sending to the rest of the world? How are we thinking about that?
And let me pick up, just in case we run out of time, I'd like to pick up your question as well.
Sure, thank you. So my name is Fatima Zahra. I'm a global shaper from Morocco. And so as we take the long view, we often tend to think in terms of systems, but then we also need to remind ourselves that systems, they're at the heart of systems there are people, right? That create the systems, that sustain the systems. And I feel like there are two crises that we deal with so much short-termism. That is one, the mental health crisis and the well-being crisis. And what I mean by well-being is like the overall well-being, financial, physical, mental, and emotional. And the second one is people who are falling through the cracks in our systems. So how can we shift to taking a long view when it comes to these two crises as well?
Thank you for that. And I don't think you posed them to anyone in specific, so who would like to? Lily, you have an idea?
Why don't I actually get it get it kickstarted? I completely agree. Even looking at it from a supply chain perspective, even though we talk about the technology, it's always with the human in the loop. And when we think about all those that we serve, and beyond obviously our own employees, drivers as an example, I started to talk about this, but their livelihood is incredibly difficult. And when we think about ways in which that we can really improve their day-to-day, it's, combination, right? We are actively building communities to bring more drivers into the workforce, but specifically also looking at women and minority drivers as well, and thinking about ways in which we can provide education, content, safety, right, so that they can actually build careers and professions, at least in trucking, and be able to thrive in that. But we also think about it from a software perspective, and the software, we believe, like, so much is being done manually, and it's incredibly difficult. And the software that we build is actually very intuitive for those who adopt, right? So, we believe that the software we build needs to be an extension and really meet people where they're at, so that it's incredibly easy, it's very seamless, and it really improves a lot of their day-to-day.
Thank you for that. I want to, we're down to our last couple of minutes, so I want to turn to Marco and then the Minister to close off for us. Please do deal with this energy question, the materials question. I know you must be thinking about this a lot. And then, Mr. Minister, you can pick up anything you've heard, and then we'll come to a close.
Yeah. Short answer is, well, we see the future as multi-energy, many different sources. The important thing here is to get the ESG implementation practices right. ESG has to be multilaterally built. It's not a top-down approach. We are doing that, for example, the new development bank. So if you're talking about mitigation, adaptation, even transition, the ESG considerations are there. And for the next cycle of 5 years in our strategy, 40% of everything that we finance will be related to climate, and therefore assist with this different approaches towards the multi-energy future that we want to build.
Well, I'd like to conclude that there is really no silver bullet. No silver bullet for improving and embedding long-term in thinking in decision-making, be it government or companies or even think tanks. But I believe there are some key levers and enablers, particularly in making sure we can achieve and be firm with our long-term view. In brief, these include strengthening institutional voices for the future, policy commitment devices. We can use legal mandates, for example, having champion for key issues, as well encouraging creativity in all civil society, civil service, and all the relevant groups. So it has to be, we have to plan for flexibility and agility, importance of leadership, institutionalizing the future legal issues, right? And then we have to be, what's also important is consistent public communications to raise awareness and importance of the long view for our children's future. Last two is, of course, building economic resilience. And finally, when policy making, it has to be collaborative.
Thank you for that. So, Mr. Special Representative, I'm sorry we lost time to come back to Ukraine. I mentioned inflection points, World War I, World War II. I think what we've heard in all of these answers is you can't avoid the short-term decisions. You have to make the short-term decisions. But if you don't build in the long-term, you're risking the future. And as we look at, you talked about how one has to think already about the future of Russia. You heard President Zelensky today, or yesterday, anyway, this week, talking about urging all of us to think about Ukraine's future and also for the rebuilding and reconstruction. So I think if we walk away from anything, is World War I, we didn't think about the future, we thought about short-termism. After World War II, we got it much better. Not perfect, but better. We are in that position right now. So whether it's in your businesses, whether it's in your social lives, whether, as you said, it's mental health, you never think you can avoid the short term, but if you're not building in the long term, then you're not going to get the right outcome. So thank you so much for these speakers. And thank you for your questions from the audience.